So now that I got a handle on the raise lower terrain tool or terrain brush, I want to explore some of the other tools that come with the terrain editor. Now the tool just to the right of the raise and lower terrain brush is the paint height brush, and this works almost exactly like the raise and lower brush with one big difference, and that is I can still adjust the brush size and I can also adjust the opacity, but I can also set the absolute height of the brush. So if I move this brush down to say 70, and I'll paint, as I continue to paint, once that terrain height reaches a height of 70 meters, it starts to plateau. So I can gain a lot of control over this with this tool. If I want to make a raised path that travels around an area, I can step this down by just reducing the height of this just a little bit and going back in and painting. I can reduce it quite a bit more and reduce the brush size and sort of really kind of create some different details here. So I can get more precise control over my environment by using both the raise and lower terrain height tool and the paint height tool. So I'll continue to experiment with those and sculpt my environment to rough out the concept, and then once I get the rough shape done, I can move over to the next tool, which is the smooth height tool. And the smooth tool is basically just going to smooth out the transitions from one area to the next. So I'll just bump up my brush size here to demonstrate this point, and I'll focus on this area where I used a real grungy brush to create this rough surface. And as I paint over that, you can see that I can completely smooth that out. So if I'm unhappy with the transition of one area to the next, or one polygon to the next, I can just kind of zoom in here. I'll pan over, and let's say I want to smooth this area out. I'll just reduce my brush size just a bit and focus on just these edges that I want to smooth out. So it gives me a lot of control. Now, I'm not going to overthink what this terrain looks like at this point because I am still just experimenting with these tools. I'll eventually make a pass and try to create the basic shape of my island, but it'll still be kind of an abstract concept until we get some things in to help create some contrast in our environment. And the next thing that we can do to help create some contrast is to start to paint textures on the terrain that we've created. Now, in order to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the next tool over. This is the Paint Texture tool. And in order to get this tool to work, we need to edit or add textures. Now, once the brush is selected, I'm going to choose the brush that I want to use, and I'm just going to stick with the soft edge brush. I'm going to click the Edit Textures button, and I only have one option, and that is to add a texture. Once I add texture, I get this Add Texture dialog box that pops up, and I want to focus on the texture swatch, and I'll hit the Select button. What I'm doing now is I'm looking inside the Assets folder. Unity came with some basic textures that I can use, and not all of these are fit to apply to my terrain object, but I do have a few. I have this object or this texture called Good Dirt. I have an object called Grass Hill, Grass Rock, and I also have this cliff layer up here. I'm going to get started by applying this Grass Hill texture, and I'll just double click on it. That'll load it inside the swatch field. And I also have this size field underneath, and by default it's going to set the XY size of the texture to 15, and I'm just going to let it default. I'll probably want to come back and tweak that a little bit later, but I'll add this. And so what that does is it applies this grass texture to an active texture that I can use for my brush. Now by default, the first texture that I add, the entire terrain assumes that texture, and that's just fine. I want to add a second texture, and what I'll do is I'll go back to the Edit Texture button, and this time around you can see because I have one existing texture, I have a couple of different options here, but I still want to stick with the Add Texture. This time around I'm going to choose a different texture by hitting the Select button, and I'll choose this Grass Rock texture. I'll double click, I'll add the texture. Now I have two textures to choose from that I can start to paint on this terrain. Now if I go back over and I start to paint and I'm clicking and I'm painting and nothing is happening, that's because the grass texture is still selected and I'm just painting more grass on top of an existing texture. I'm going to select my Grass Rock texture, and now you can see when I start to paint I'm actually layering that texture on top of the existing grass texture layer. So I'm just painting right on top of it. Okay. And again, at this point, I'm not so concerned about the design. I'm just really want to experiment with the tool set that I have here. So I'll play back and forth between the brush size and the opacity and see how that starts to affect things. Now, there is one thing that's jumping out at me that I really don't like, and that is that I'm getting an obvious tile for my textures. I'm getting a repeating pattern in my textures, and it's so obvious, I think it's distracting. And I can fix that by expanding the size of the tile of the texture. So in other words, currently I can almost identify, let me try to get rid of this hot spot of the brush. I can start to identify and almost count. There's one tile, there's 2, 3, 4. So if I look at almost the striping that's happening on my terrain, that's the vertical and horizontal, or the XY repetition of these individual tiles. This is just a small, simple JPEG that's being repeated over this terrain, and it's being repeated so many times that I can really easily identify that pattern. And all I have to do in this case is I'm going to go back to my texture tool, my texture brush. I'm going to double click on this existing texture that I loaded, and I'm going to change the tile size. Now by default it was 15, and so I'm just going to double that value. Now I'm influencing the grass texture, and so as I bump this value up, you can see that that texture dynamically is resizing. And I want to keep these textures square for reasons that we'll talk about later when we take a deeper dive into modeling and texturing. But I want to keep these values proportionate to each other. And I just bump that up to about 45. Now I'm still seeing some repeating in the texture, but it's not as bad on the grass as it is in this dirt texture. So I'll just apply that. I'm pretty happy with that. I'll go back to this rock dirt texture, and I'll choose the same size that I chose for the grass, and I'll apply that. And that looks a lot better. Now, again, it still might be too small, but we'll make that decision when we actually get down on our terrain and start walking around and look at it at the ground level. So I want to continue to play with these tools. We'll take a look at the rest of the terrain tools a little bit later on in the presentation. The next thing I want to do is I want to add some water to the scene and start talking about cameras and lighting, so we get a sense of all the tools that we'll utilize in this first major project. But we'll do that in the next presentation.